Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for signing in today. I can see, as usual, that we still have folks who are signing in, but I'm just going to get started on the introductions in the interest of time. Many of you know me, but for those of you who don't, my name is Haley Ross, and I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, or CMI for short. And I'm joined here today by Kendall Benish with the Kootenay Conservation Program, otherwise known as KCP. CMI and KCP have again joined forces to present the 8th season of CMI's Cred Talks and the 10th season of KCP's Winter Webinar Series. Now, before we truly get started, what I'd like to do is just acknowledge that the region in which both our organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Shakwapam, the Tanaha, the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and all living things since time immemorial. Now, I invite you, as we have been doing in the past webinars, to introduce yourself in the chat. And while you're doing so, please feel free to identify the Indigenous lands in which you zoom in from today. While that comes in, I'm just going to introduce the series. So this season of webinars will explore the theme of wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity. We're welcoming 8 speakers who will discuss this theme from different perspectives to provide a wide view that can help inform conservation of connected, resilient landscapes in the Columbia Basin. This year's series is financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust and also by LGL Limited. Many thanks to both of these organizations for helping to ensure that we can continue to offer this series free of charge. And most importantly, thanks to all of you. Thanks for tuning in today for what will be the 5th webinar in the series, where Tracy Lee, Director and where Tracy, Director of Conservation Research at Mistaki Institute, will review several road ecology research initiatives that are identifying where wildlife cross roads and how we can invest in solutions to reduce the impact on species from pronghorn to wood frogs. Tracy will explore efforts to build social capital around road mitigation and better integrate road and landscape connectivity concerns into transportation planning and policy. So thanks for introducing yourself. I can see those rolling in. As they continue to come in, I'm just going to speak briefly about who CMI is and what we do. So CMI is a nonprofit society and an association working for people in the various fields of ecology. We provide professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, and webinars, of course, that address everything from skill-based research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website is a great place to learn more about what we do, of course, and on there are fantastic resources, including the recordings from talks like this and proceedings from all of our major events. So I encourage you to check that out. Now I'd like to pass it over to Kendall Benish.
Thanks, Haley. My name's Kendall Benish, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenay Conservation Program, or KCP. KCP is a diverse network of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, federal, provincial, and local governments, First Nations, land trusts, agricultural producers, and educational institutions who all contribute to conserving our region. The purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve and steward landscapes that sustain biodiversity and naturally functioning ecosystems, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, which includes building technical knowledge in webinars like this. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar series again with Haley and CMI, and would like to give an additional thanks to all of our program sponsors, without whom we wouldn't be able to support this type of work. Just a couple housekeeping details and we'll get started. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar to add a question to the queue, and we'll do our best to make our way through them. You can also utilize the upvote button in the Q&A. So while you're in there, if you see a question that's similar to yours or that you'd also like answered, please press the thumbs up button by that question. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Tracy Lee. Tracy spends a lot of time trying to figure out how we can better coexist with wildlife and natural systems. Tracy has worked at Mistaki Institute for over 25 years, and during this time has helped develop a road ecology program that encompasses research to identify where wildlife and roads intersect, identifying solutions to reduce road impacts, and working to better integrate landscape connectivity into planning and policy. Tracy likes to read about evolution, nature, and wildlife. And we're so excited to have Tracy presenting with us today. And you can go ahead and share your screen now and start your presentation, Tracy.
Great, thank you so much, Kendall. All right. Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. If you can see from the title of my talk, I'm wondering if anyone can figure out which book I was reading when I came up with this title of this talk. So if you put that in the chat, and I'll tell you at the end. If you read my abstract and you look at the title, I think some of you might be able to figure it out if you're into reading nature conservation. Anyway, before I begin, I just also wanted to talk about this very photogenic bear on my first slide here. We have a partnership project in southwestern Alberta with the Nature Conservancy, where we've set up cameras on existing infrastructure that goes under Highway 3. And there's no fencing associated with this infrastructure. It's just existing highway infrastructure. And we wanted to understand, is anything using or passing through these structures? And we've had cameras up for 3 years, and we literally, this is previous to this exciting photo. This is what we had captured over 3 years, is a wild turkey with its babies crossing through. And I thought this was, you can imagine the volunteer excitement when this came up. We actually caught this bear on camera about, I think maybe a month before we ended that project. So it was kind of exciting. I don't really know what that tells us about crossing success, probably not very much, but it's a fantastic photo. All right, so as was introduced, I work for the Mistaki Institute. We are a not-for-profit charitable institute that's affiliated with Mount Royal University. And we have kind of three research theme areas: biological conservation, landscape connectivity, and ecosystem-based adaptation for climate. And we try to really get information into the hands of communities and decision makers to promote healthy landscapes. So our name, Mistaki, is a Blackfoot word that means backbone of the world. And we're very proud of that name. We are situated on Treaty 7 lands, and that includes the Blackfoot, the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai Nation, as well as Tsuut'ina Nation, and as well as Stoney Nakoda, including the Bearspaw First Nation, the Chiniki First Nation, and the Weasley First Nation, as well as Métis Region 3. We are committed to truth and reconciliation. The projects I'm going to talk about today don't have good Indigenous engagement, but hopefully that's something that will be changing soon. All right, so I'm tasked with talking about roads and the impact of roads on kind of movement of animals. And so to start talking about that, I think we should set the scene with kind of, I think, helping understand why animals need to move. And I'm going to do that through a series of looking at or thinking about 3 different species. This first photo, which I think is another incredible photo, is taken in the city of Calgary. And it's at a wetland in one of their natural environment parks, but in quite an urbanized area. And it's a black-crowned night heron eating a tiger salamander. And so if we can just step back and think about the different needs of these species from a movement perspective, the tiger salamander spends most of its time in upland habitat burrowed underground. It then emerges in the early spring and has to migrate down to a breeding pond where it lays its eggs, and then it wanders back up to its upland habitat. A young tiger salamander will also disperse up to 1 kilometer from its natal wetland to a nearby wetland. And so can you imagine the difficulty in trying to manage or plan for this species in an urban environment? We tend to mow up to the edge of wetlands. We put roads in between wetlands. We develop up close to wetlands. So you can just imagine the complexity of trying to maintain movement for this species on the landscape. Now, the black-crowned night heron has kind of 2 different, I'm going to call them lifestyles. Some are just resident. They live in the same area and in a small spatial scale all year long. But there's another lifestyle where they actually migrate very long distances, and they might actually overwinter in Mexico. So can you imagine trying to plan for animal movement from a species that moves from Mexico to Canada for its breeding. So just trying to get a handle here on the complexity of the needs for movement, and also why I think we're in the 6th grade extinction. You can start to understand how complex this is with how humans operate on the landscape. And the last species I want to talk about is the pronghorn antelope, which are one of the fastest land mammals. They can run 88 kilometers an hour, which I think is astounding. I actually had to check if that was accurate because I remember Paul Jones from the Alberta Conservation Association telling me that. And I was like, that can't be right. That is how fast they can run. And pronghorn also have 2 different lifestyles. So this is an area here in Montana. This is Alberta, and this is Saskatchewan. This is the Trans-Canada, and Medicine Hat is right here. And this is the movement of a pronghorn, one collared female, for a 52-week period. And you're seeing a dot every 52 weeks. And what I want you to pay attention to is you're suddenly going to see a big spring migration where they follow the green up. And so they're following the most, here we are, the most nutritious time, or the most nutrients is when they follow that spring green up. And so you can see this huge movement. It was 454 kilometers, that spring movement. And this whole movement series that you're seeing right now is a 52-week period or a year. And the individual moved 800 kilometers. And so you can just imagine what it had to navigate through Alberta and Saskatchewan, the number of roads it had to cross. This individual actually got hung up for 3 days on the Trans-Canada, paralleling and going back and forth along the highway before it figured out where to cross. And then, as many of you probably know, pronghorn have to contend with fences. There's many, many fences on this landscape. And pronghorn don't like to jump over fences. They like to crawl under, as this photo demonstrates. And so work from the Alberta Conservation Association and Paul Jones has determined that to help facilitate movement for pronghorn in their migration, we should have fence wires be smooth and be 18 inches off the ground so they can slide under. So again, if we think about the tiger salamander in the urban environment, we think about the black-crowned night heron going from Mexico to Canada, and we think about a pronghorn that actually some of them move between Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan on these migrations. We can start to understand the complexity of just movement in general and in specifically roads, which is what we're supposed to focus on today. So I think I've highlighted the problem. Animals need to move, and they need to move at many different scales, and they need to move at many different times. And that's complicated. What we like to do is build roads throughout their habitat. And so wildlife, to be able to maintain movement, have to move across these roads. And that can lead to kind of 2 big problems. One is it can cause direct mortality with collisions. And if you're a big thing like a moose or an elk or a bear, the collisions can be a motorist safety risk and can be very costly. And then as we build more and more roads, some animals will just completely avoid, depending on the traffic volume, they might just completely avoid trying to cross the road. And this leads to fragmentation of the habitat. So we end up reducing the amount of access they have to the resources that they need for their life cycles. So we do have solutions. This is a report with many really well-known road ecologists in 2008. It was a report to US Congress. It was, I think, requested by the US Federal Highway Administration. And they were asking, how do we reduce collisions? So as we are humans, we tend to focus on how animal movement across roads affect us, which is motorist safety risk. And I think most of us can understand why. So this particular study was looking at, well, how do we reduce vehicle collisions? And they did a review of the literature and studies to determine the effectiveness of all these different prevention strategies. And we can see here, which is, and I'm sure many of you are from Alberta and British Columbia, and you've seen the number of reflectors that we have up on our side of the road. And this study, the literature shows that really those are 0% effective. Whistles, standard road signs, which we habituate to, and so on. The ones that actually seem to be effective in 2008, and again, I think they're looking to update this report, but were animal detection systems or fencing, a series of fences, underpasses and overpasses, or bridges and tunnels that enable animals to move safely, but actually block them from getting onto the roadway. So I want to point something out. The 3 here reduced speed limit, which is inconclusive, seasonal warning signs, which means it's not always there. Maybe it flashes seasonally, or maybe it gets removed and put back seasonally. Something changes that helps you not habituate to it. And animal detection systems all rely on human behavior. They all rely on us paying attention and slowing down or heeding the risk. I'm going to let you think about that for a moment. Whereas this fencing and underpasses and overpasses actually removes the problem from the roadway and isn't as dependent on human behavior. That's what this system is, I think, most famous in Banff National Park, where they have a series of underpasses and overpasses and fencing, and we all drive through Banff safely for the most part. So I think there's some complicating factors about the solution. So it sounds all like, okay, we have a problem, we have a solution, everything's good. Well, everything is not good. And that's because there's these complicating factors. And I'm going to go into detail, just a little tiny bit of detail on each one. The first is that, as you recall from our conversation or my beginning of my talk, where I talked about the tiger salamander, the black-crowned night heron, and the pronghorn, species have different needs. So they actually need to cross in different places, and the structures they like to use for crossing can be different. So this causes complication, and it causes us to have to be very thoughtful. How do we define ecological success? So how many individuals need to cross for us to say that's a success from an ecological perspective or a population level perspective? I think that's really tricky to answer because we often don't have the information we need. And then traditionally, what has driven investment in road mitigation infrastructure, like I've presented the solutions, is motorist safety risk, which is great from a motorist safety risk perspective and for species that are involved in causing motorist safety risk, which tends to be larger mammals, but not so great for small things. So let's just talk about each of those points. So species have different needs. This is a great photo that was just recently taken down on the Trans-Canada Highway, where we were on a field trip with provincial government agencies in Alberta and Saskatchewan and other conservation organizations to look at where pronghorn are crossing the Trans-Canada Highway. And we visited 6 potential sites, and we saw pronghorn at all 6, which I thought was very exciting. But anyway, why I wanted to talk about pronghorn again is because there was a study in Wyoming in 2006 by Sawyer et al. And the Wyoming Department of Transportation, on a 20-kilometer stretch of one of their interstates, built 6 underpasses and 2 overpasses. They then studied these for 3 years to determine the detections for movement across these structures for mule deer and pronghorn. So both species that migrate in the spring and the fall. And I mean, they had a lot of detections. They had 40,000 mule deer detections and 20,000 pronghorn detections at these crossing structures. And 79% of the mule deer used the underpass, and 93% of the pronghorn used the overpass. So what we saw here was species-specific selection in the crossing structures that they wanted to use. And if you think about pronghorn are very, predator adverse, and like maybe to go over where they feel safer is kind of the theory. So it's not that maybe pronghorn wouldn't use an underpass, but maybe the line of sight would be really important. So maybe where the road is elevated and if you made it wide enough. So you can just start to see, you have to start to get into these nuanced discussions about what you're trying to get to cross the road and how it wants to cross. So that can get really complicated. How do we define success? This might be one of the only pictures I took. It's a pretty dismal looking picture, but it's a super cool picture, actually. This is a culvert underpass for long-toed salamanders in Waterton Lakes National Park. So Waterton actually has a population of long-toed salamanders that in the winter or most of the year is burrowed underground in this nice upland habitat. And then in the early spring, as the tiger salamander in Calgary, they come down and they have to cross this road that goes into town and down into their breeding pond called Linnet Lake. And so what Waterton noticed is that they were losing a lot of tiger salamanders getting run over on this road. So they built this mitigation infrastructure to facilitate movement. And indeed, they have identified and seen pronghorn move under this culvert. And it's what do you call that when someone's like the first in? It's like a first sight. I can't remember the word right now, but it's amazing that they did this. And it's one of the first sites to kind of think of it from an amphibian perspective. However, how do we actually define success? A recent study by Cheryl, I'm going to say Brahmi, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, in 2001 was looking at a similar system to this for tiger salamander in California, where they had, I believe it was 3 culverts. And they were able to set up these cameras that take photos based on like a laser beam for movement. And so they were able to take photos all along the fences and in the culverts to determine which tiger salamanders were using the underpasses. And they individually identified the tiger salamanders using AI pattern recognition, because, like tiger salamanders are blushing. So they were able to identify an individual tiger salamander and see how far it would move along the fence. And they came up with a give up distance of 40 meters. So once the tiger salamander had moved 40 meters, if it didn't reach the culvert, it gave up. And so they, hey, we're kind of filtering the population. Like not all the individuals are actually getting through our mitigation structure. And they went further to analyze that to pass 90% of the adult tiger salamanders across the road, you would have to have culverts 12.5 meters apart. So I don't tell you this to challenge that this system in Waterton isn't working. I think it is working. The question is, are we doing enough? And so, are we putting them close enough together? Are they the right structures? There's a lot of complexity in this solution that we still need to learn about and discover. And that's highlighted even further in this new paper that was just out, I think literally 3 weeks ago, that has lots of really well-known road ecologists on it, and the Journal of Applied Ecology, where they actually did a review on crossing structures and different species groups and how successful crossing structures are at moving these different species groups. And you can see they had these interesting categories. Did this research or this study, did the crossing structure prevent movement decline? Did it restore movement? Did it improve movement? Or did it just allow movement? And they found, and they concluded in this paper that for most structure types and groups or species groups that you see listed here, there was just insufficient evidence to draw generalizable conclusions. So even though we have solutions and we know they work, I'm challenging, are we doing enough and do we know enough? So we still, this is still an area where we need a lot of active research. And the idea is that as we learn, we would modify. We might have to go back and modify some of these things. And there's lots of examples of that where we've done kind of some mitigation and then we've realized, geez, if we put some brush in, smaller things will cross. If we put a ramp in a culvert, medium mammals will cross, or medium-sized carnivores will cross. So there's lots of learnings, I think, that we still need to have. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about what drives decision making, and we're going to talk more about animal vehicle collisions in just a second. But this is a project that we're working on where I just showed you that pronghorn. That pronghorn actually crossed at our site 5 here. This is our site that we'd like to see mitigation on the Trans-Canada. And this was a project where we used citizen science, a landscape connectivity model to identify these 16 sites for pronghorn, and we prioritized them through field investigation with a whole team of a big working group, including the provincial agencies on both sides. And what I want to draw your attention to is we also wanted to understand, how does the pronghorn crossing issue relate to the motorist safety risk issue, which is what drives a lot of decision-making for investment. And so I'm going to zoom into this area right here. And so this is the Trans-Canada. Medicine Hat is right here. This AB4 is the significant motorist safety risk. This is where we have a high cluster of road collisions happening right, or animal vehicle collisions happening right here. And it's predominantly deer. This is the key site for pronghorn movement. And it is not a hotspot for animal vehicle collisions. And you can see it's about 4 kilometers to the west. And so if we are just mitigating for animal vehicle collisions, we might be missing an opportunity to address a species of conservation concern and the movement needs for a species for conservation concern. So why is motorist safety risk driving where we invest in solutions for movement across the highway? Well, this is a picture taken in the Crow's Nest Pass quite some time ago now, where a semi hit a herd of elk, and this was the result. And I think right away it makes you understand why, if you're a transportation agency and your mandate is to address this safe movement of people and goods, you understand why they're trying to address these areas that are of highest risk to motorist safety. It makes sense. And I can imagine on this webinar today that probably there's not very many of you that have not either hit an animal or know someone who's hit an animal that's close to you. So, you know, it is a very big issue that transportation agencies need to contend with. I'm going to talk about kind of 3 areas for motorist safety risk and animal vehicle collisions. I'm going to talk about the Alberta Wildlife Program, Alberta Wildlife Watch Program, because I think it is a really incredible example of what transportation agencies can do. I'm going to talk about a correction factor to account for injury bias. So those animals that get hit in an animal vehicle collision, but actually don't die on the highway right away. They die off the highway right away. And then I'm going to talk about the cost of collisions and the investment in mitigative infrastructure and why in a lot of places it makes sense. So the Alberta Wildlife Watch Program, quite a mouthful, is run by the province of Alberta. And I would say it's one of the best programs I have seen for how to systematically measure clusters of motorist safety risk on your highway network. The platform is a smartphone application that highway maintenance contractors use who drive the road weekdays every morning and afternoon. And they're the ones that are responsible for moving carcasses that are a result of many wildlife vehicle collisions. And they document that through a smartphone application. So they have a GPS point, a date, and a species that they upload. That gets uploaded into a central database. And they've generated this web application that actually runs a cluster analysis live based on 5 years of data whenever you go onto the tool and check it out. And so it results, and you can click on different areas in the province and you can see, so this is southwestern Alberta, this is British Columbia here, this is the famous Highway 3, which we're going to keep talking about for a bit. And you can see in this area, this is a problem area. So this tells them where they have a motorist safety risk or where they should be considering action to invest in reducing those collisions. It's a really incredible program. It also has some dollars that allows them to implement some of these mitigations without a highway upgrade, which I think is also really unique. So big shout out for the government of Alberta on this one. So now we're going to zoom into this little area here and talk about a project that Mistaki undertook called Collision Count. We undertook this project because a leaseholder near one of the sites that we were really concerned had a high number of deer collisions told us, I come out here and he rents, it's actually Crown land, so it's provincial land, but he leases it for his cattle. And he was telling us that he keeps seeing so many dead animals, deer in particular, off the highway right away on the area where his cattle are. And he thinks it's because they're getting hit and they're dying off the road right away. And so those wouldn't be reported in your database, he kept saying. So we got pretty intrigued by this and we set up this project called Collision Count. It was a citizen science project. We picked, this is, again, that Highway 3 area we're zoomed into. British Columbia is just off the map here. This is Highway 22 coming down. And these little orange blobs represent road mitigation sites where we'd like to see road mitigation. And where you see red arrows is where we set up transects that ran parallel to the mitigation site for 50 meters off the road on both sides. So 150 meters off the road on both sides. And we asked people once a week for 5 years to walk these transects and record carcasses. Can you imagine? So dedicated, these people. This is Dorothy. I honestly would have just abandoned this transect, but here she is actually doing the transect. It's incredible. And they had this smartphone app where they'd tell us if they started and when they stopped the transect. So we actually got the 0 values because a lot of the time they walked and didn't see anything. If they saw a roadkill, they would tell us which species, the number of animals. And this is really important. They'd tell us, is it visible from the highway? So would it get picked up in road survey data or highway maintenance contractor data? Or is it not visible from the highway? And then sometimes they took a photo, which were quite grisly, to be honest with you, to help us with identification. So this went on for 5 years. And what we found was that this leaseholder was indeed correct. For every carcass that was reported by a highway maintenance contractor, 2.8 were found off the road within 150 meters on one of the either sides. So this is, I think, a really conservative estimate of how big this problem is. And this allows us to just get a better understanding of the magnitude of the issue. And also, if you're using a cost argument for for why you should invest in road mitigation, it enables us to get a better understanding of the costs. So let's just talk again about, this is that same area that we did the collision count on. This is the cost per collision for Highway 3 annually. And we used cost estimates of a collision for deer, elk, and moose based on Marcel Hewer et al. Work. He's just updated these numbers. This is US dollars, actually. So Marcel's work showed that for every time you hit an elk, that's the cost to society from vehicle repair, human injuries, human fatalities of 14,000. If you hit a moose, it's about 82,000. And so we were able to work out, okay, well, we know which species got hit in each kilometer. We know how much they cost, and we know that there's a correction factor of 2.8. And we worked out that just for this stretch, it's 8 million a year in costs. And so if you're looking at the cost of infrastructure or road mitigation infrastructure and how long that infrastructure lasts, you can see that there's actually a benefit in a lot of cases from a motorist safety risk to invest in road mitigation infrastructure. So that's all great. And I think we all get that, but let's get back to the ecological connectivity question. I want to just very quickly talk about three things. Do roads have population level impacts on species? I think they do. I think it's hard to show because we often don't have the data we need to show. Can we do better to consider ecological connectivity? Can we plan better? So can we help transportation planning incorporate ecological connectivity concerns? And do we need policy support to support investment in road mitigation for species conservation? So I don't really have the answers here for you, but in Alberta, we have a species at risk of the rattlesnake. And one of the key concerns for rattlesnake is road mortality. So I don't know exactly how that affects the population other than in the habitat management plan. This is what they're most concerned about. And I just want to think about, gosh, the complexity of trying to help snakes get across the road. Here's the sign that Alberta government put up to help warn or to help let people know that snakes frequently on this road for the next 14 kilometers. But you can just imagine the complexity of trying to solve this problem. So this is not easy stuff. It costs money and it's difficult to understand where the best investments should be. But if we want to address species at risk, we have to start addressing what the mortality risks are, right? Same with grizzly bear. Grizzly bear are a threatened species in Alberta. In the Alberta Wildlife Watch data alone, there's 12 grizzly bears in the last 5 years. And if we look at that correction factor, it's obviously significantly higher that are dying on the roads. And we all know human-caused mortality in Alberta is the #1 reason that we have grizzly bears, or one of the key reasons that we have grizzly bears at risk. And roads and rail are a big part of that problem. So I would say definitely roads have population level impacts, particularly for certain species. But I think it's really hard to tease that out based on all the other anthropogenic challenges that these animals face. Can we do a better job of transportation planning? I'm really proud of this study. This was a project that we did for Southern Alberta. And the goal of this project was to determine, can we identify from a highway network perspective where multi-species connectivity needs to be considered? And can we see how that relates to motorist safety risks? So can we build a tool, like a planning tool, that would help transportation agencies plan for both motorist safety risk and for multi-species connectivity? Oh, sorry, this picture, I was excited to tell you about this. This is, if you remember the examples I just showed you of the Highway 3, these stakes actually represent where an underpass is about to go, and Alberta Transportation and Economic Corridors had just announced the build for this underpass. And it's because this is the highest collision area, or one of the highest collision areas along Highway 3. And so we have cameras set up before construction, and it shows you, we have lots of photos of deer, and indeed deer are the ones that are involved in these collisions here. So I wanted to share that photo with you. All right, so this project had 2 key research questions, and excuse this graph, but we're going to just go through it briefly together. So the questions were, which highway sections have the highest motorist safety risk? And where does wildlife connectivity intersect with our highway network? So this whole area here, the data around motorist safety risk has been replaced by the Alberta Wildlife Watch program, which is a much better data set than the RCMP data, which is usually reported through insurance claims, and the magnitude is off and the locations are usually off. And then for wildlife connectivity, remember, this was a pilot to see if we could advise. So we picked species where we had some data. So we did a structural connectivity model, which is just, well, what's natural and left? So species agnostic. And then we had mule deer, pronghorn, rattlesnake, and grizzly bear. For all of these data sets, we translated the models into indices on the highway network. So for every kilometer section on the highway network, we had a value, an index value from 0 to 1 on its importance for these different connectivity models or for motorist safety. And then we were able to develop these mitigation priority indexes. So depending on who you were, you could look at just where ecological connectivity was important across your highway network, or you could look at a combination of both motorist safety risk and human activity. So it enabled flexibility. It was really trying to get people to think, right, about both of these issues. This is what the connectivity models typically look like. I'm sure many of you have seen them. As we're going from blue to yellow, we have increasing connectivity. And we often hand these off to people, like transportation planners, and say, here's where connectivity is important. And I think they look at us and say, great, how do I use that? And so our way to try and use that was to translate these maps into these maps. This is the kilometer section highway network maps for the province. And as we're going from yellow to red, we're having increase in structural connectivity importance for that kilometer. And we did this for rattlesnake and grizzly bear and all those other species I talked about. So now it's kind of in a format that transportation planning can use. And then you can go further with our mitigation priority tool, and you can look at, as I said, combinations just for all ecological connectivity or just motorist safety, or you can combine things. Here we're looking at, well, where is there alignment between structural connectivity and motorist safety risk? So the highest areas of motorist safety risk and the most important areas for structural connectivity, where do those align? And this might help you prioritize where you want to invest in road mitigation, because you've got good alignment between a naturally connected landscape and motorist safety risk. And this is, assuming a naturally connected landscape is important for biodiversity. So the lessons learned from this project were that, road mitigation through conversations with we did have the transportation agency and the environment and protected areas. So the government agencies that are responsible for motorist safety and wildlife at the table. And, what it can be quite costly, wildlife mitigations or the solutions, but the needs are really widespread. So because it's costly and the needs are widespread, we determined that prioritization is an important process for the province, that traditional approaches to planning for road mitigation tend to focus on sections where we have the highest number of ABCs, and that's usually driven by deer. Now, I know there's lots of examples of specific locations where bighorn sheep might be the biggest issue, or elk. But if you look at the Alberta Wildlife Watch data province-wide, it is really heavily driven by deer. And then if we continue to just think about things from a motorist safety risk, we may be missing opportunities to address fragmentation from roads for key species. So this leads us to, well, then why aren't transportation agencies and environment or fish and game departments working together? And I think they are working together in lots of places, but they're also not working together in lots of places. And so what's been starting to happen in the United States, which I think is incredible, is these state habitat connectivity policies. And what this does is it mandates the state departments of transportation, which are called DOTs, which I think is so cool. They're called DOTs, like those jot doobies. I think this is so neat. So the Montana DOT is their Montana Department of Transportation. So it mandates the DOTs to work with the fish and game departments and to identify areas where ecological connectivity is important. And this has led to these states developing statewide connectivity plans that are then informed and used in transportation planning. So if they go to do a road upgrade, they say, oh, look, we have this species of risk that our fish and game guys are concerned about here. We should talk to them about, what we can do about mitigating for that. So it might help direct or prioritize areas that have both motorist safety and species at risk concerns, for example. And you can see here, like if you looked at this map 5 years ago, it would not look like this. We have the dark purple is where there's actually legislation already enacted. And then the light purple is where it's proposed and hasn't passed yet. This is The Center for Large Landscape Conservation in the US, this is a map from them and it keeps track of all this stuff. And if you're interested in that policy, they're really into the nuances and understanding that stuff. So I think I'm almost done. I feel like I've been talking forever. The takeaways are that, yes, I think roads are a really big issue for wildlife. I think we need to know more. So these, do we have to keep studying these things? Yes, we do have to keep studying these things because there's lots we don't know. I think we need to plan better. And I think there's lots of examples, particularly in the United States, where there's huge headway being made. And not to say that there isn't good headway in Alberta. I think there is some good communication going on, but I think we can always do better. And then I would just challenge us to think, are we doing enough for biodiversity? And I think this is foreshadowing Rob Amen's talk, because I think he's going to talk about global examples of crossings. And I think he's going to make us look not so good. That's what I think is going to happen. I think globally, we're seeing some pretty cool stuff. And I have a lot of, very lucky to have opportunity to spend time in Uganda, East Africa every summer. And recently when I was back, they have built a new freeway. And they have a lot of these huge wetland or papyrus swamps that are super important. And they built this new freeway over the papyrus swamp, 1 kilometer in length over top, elevated over top of this ecosystem that's so important. And then you drive further and there's an 800-meter span crossing the next wetland. Like this is a whole, we're quibbling over the size of an overpass or an underpass, or trying to modify an existing structure where it is, or the distance between a little culvert for a salamander. This is, I think, was pretty eye-opening for me, some of the progress that's being made elsewhere. I just leave you with this last quote and let you know that this is the first overpass in the province of Alberta outside of the Banff National Park system, so built by the government of Alberta over the Trans-Canada Highway, just near Exshaw. It's for grizzly bear, elk, and many other species. And I'm pretty excited to see that happening. So that's pretty cool. And I love this quote: do your best until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I think that applies to our road ecology. And that is it, people. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was incredible and such a contribution to this series. I know everyone who joined today will be taking away a lot, and really, taking away lots on how we can and how we really should plan better for the future. Pictures say 1,000 words, such incredible images in there. And I think I'll always remember Dorothy there doing her 52 transects for 5 years. That's 260 transects. Like, what a legend.
Yes.
That's so great. So we do have about 15 minutes left for questions. If you haven't already, please add your questions using the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll do our best to wrap up all the questions before 1 p.m. And use that upvote function. So there's a little thumbs up by questions. If you see a question that you'd really like answered, please press that button. And before we
Kendall, can I ask, did anyone guess my book?
I was just going to say, so
sorry.
I think we just had one person, Pam Zevitt, guessed, and let's see if this is correct, Ben Goldfarb's new book. Is that correct?
Actually, it's not, but I did just read that and really enjoyed it. It's Elizabeth Colbert's The Sixth Extinction. That's what I had just finished reading that. I didn't want to read it because it's such a depressing title, but I'm so glad I read it. It was such a great book, but I was feeling very like, woe is the world when I wrote my abstract. So I would recommend the book, even though the title is heavy.
Oh, excellent. Thanks, Tracy. Okay, so I'll just hop into the Q&A here. So the first question from Renee is, wonderful presentation, Tracy. Thank you. Can you speak a bit more about animal detection systems and how they work? I presume these technologies are less expensive than overpasses.
Yes. So I actually don't know a lot about animal detection systems. Where the government of Alberta is just starting to test one along Highway 22, is my understanding. And I know about the one in British Columbia along Highway 3. And so the essential idea is that there's beams going across parallel to the road. It detects an animal and it causes a big flashing sign. And so that is supposed to result in you as the driver slowing down because it's telling you that there's something maybe about to approach the road. The ones in British Columbia are really long, like they're super long systems. And my understanding is a lot of the time, or one of the issues with these systems is that people, if they don't see an animal, but they keep seeing it flashing, then they start to not believe the system and they start to habituate to not change their driving behavior. So I think they've proven to be very effective in some places where they're quite narrow, and that technology is constantly advancing. But I'm always really skeptical of things that rely on humans making a judgment call, which is maybe I need to be more humanistic.
That's great. Thanks, Tracy. Next we have from Jessica. If we know of areas where road mortality for species, for example, for Western toad or Western painted turtles, is a concern, do you have any advice about how to pursue getting a road crossing installed? Any advice on first steps of data collection to make a stronger argument for road crossing installation?
Yeah, so I think this is where that systematic planning comes into play. I think the policy that's driving US states to have to look at where connectivity across roads is important for different species highlights areas that then get attention. So in the states, it required policy to force those conversations because I think agency people they're just busy. People are busy, right? So reaching out and getting to know your transportation department can be difficult. So I think things have to start happening. If we're really serious about maintaining biodiversity, I think things have to start happening at a higher level. But if you're a local group, I think the best thing you can do is engage with your fish and wildlife representatives, with the transportation, and start talking about it. There's so many wonderful examples of citizen science projects documenting areas that are problematic. And I would encourage you to look some of those up. I can share, I don't know, I have lots of links on stuff like that would help you establish a program that collects the information that then you can have more meaningful conversations with your transportation and your local biologists. But I think the local biologists from the government I've found to be real champions for this stuff, and are knowledgeable that there are problems happening and want to fix these things. There's not process or programs in place to enable the investment. That's where we're stuck right now.
Yeah, and so Pamela has more of a comment here, which that you may be able to comment on is, so thinking through the local government lens where development pressures and exponentially increasing road densities in greenfield areas is a huge issue. There's a complete lack of funding for municipalities to undertake transportation ecology BMPs and address road wildlife conflicts. There's a strong reluctance to make developers pay for this type of mitigation, the same way we require payment for servicing infrastructure for people, and for upgrades and retrofits to existing carnage zones. For example, roads that cut through biodiversity hotspots. There's no mechanism to increase or source funding to address these issues. Even a small animal underpass can cost upwards of $300,000 to install. Then there's monitoring and maintenance costs.
Yes, that's very well said. It's just, we know there's solutions, we know we should be doing it, but there's the programs to invest or enable that to happen are minimal. It's super challenging.
Yeah.
It's super challenging.
Okay, a question from Tracy. Yeah, I'm wondering if the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure consults with people like yourself when designing wildlife crossings. And then as a follow-up, do you have specific info or insight into the bighorn sheep crossing being installed in Radium this spring?
Yeah, I'm excited about that Radium. I've tangentially just heard about it and have heard people talking that it's going to be done. And I'm excited to see that. But I don't know any of the specifics about it. I think it's an overpass, if I'm remembering correctly. I can't remember the width or any of the details, though. And then the other question was, I like to think that our information is useful. And I think sometimes it is, but I think it's person dependent. yeah, I think the most important thing we've tried to do is get the information that we generate into the hands of the biologists that are trying to make the case for investment in these things. And I think, you know, we have to support government in making these decisions. We need to support our biologists and empower them to work with transportation to identify key areas. I mean, I have seen lots of progress. Like if you look at the ARC Solutions has a website where they track crossing structure investments. And like, it's really astounding what's starting to happen. The US federal highways just launched a huge grant program for US states. They were funding statewide connectivity plans. They were funding underpasses and overpasses, and the funding had to not just address a motorist safety, but also address like a migratory corridor or important movement area for biodiversity. So, you know, there is, like in the last 10 years, there's just an astounding amount of progress. Like it seems like it's not gone anywhere, but like when was the last time you saw, you know, a crossing structure other than Banff 10 years ago? And now it's starting to become part of the language. And, you know, Alberta Transportation has a whole program dedicated to this issue. So I feel like things are, I don't want to be all too doom and gloom. I think there is good progress being made. It's just a question of, is it going to ramp up big enough, quickly enough? I don't know.
Great. Okay, Emily's wondering if you can share the link to the paper that looked at the effectiveness of the various potential solutions like reflectors, whistles, signage, fencing, etc.
Yes, if you put in, because I'm probably not fast enough to do that right now, if you put in collision prevention report to US Congress 2008, it should come up in your Google.
Great. I think Haley's doing that right now.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
So
There's a whole
she'll
team
pop
of
it in the
people here.
Awesome.
Like,
thanks so much, Haley. Okay, Douglas is wondering what resources or funding are needed to optimize wildlife safety, and are there ideas or examples of making auto or trucking corporations pay for these mitigation needs?
so that's a complicated question. Like in BC, I think you have one insurer. So there's definitely been a lot of conversations with ICBC, I believe it is called. I'm not sure. The last time I heard, they do fund some education, and some have funded in the past some research on motorist safety risk issues related to wildlife vehicle collisions. But if you talk to them, it's not their biggest driver of risk. So I think the dollars get invested where they see bigger risk. And then in Alberta, it's independent insurers. So there's not one body you can go to, which is really complicated. And I tried to go to like car companies thinking that this would be, you know, a really good thing for them to fund. And they told me, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's like bad for cars. That's like drawing people's attention to risks. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to fund anything like that. So I'm not sure. I don't think we've cracked that funding angle, so to speak.
Yeah. Thank you. Catherine is wondering, in the map showing wildlife crossing in southern Alberta along Highway 1, I noticed a strong correlation between where irrigation is creating grazing potential for wild species, which will become even more important with the current drought. Do your models incorporate any data about irrigation and agriculture?
Agriculture, yes. So the pronghorn model and the mule deer model that we use in the connectivity models that were used, we use like a land cover data set that identifies your agriculture crops, not specifically irrigated agriculture crops. They're just kind of classified as crops. So I'm not sure I'm getting at the nuance that you are referring to. But certainly, like, one of the really interesting things about pronghorn is their migration is a learned route. There's kind of pretty high, not total site fidelity, but there's high fidelity to the movement route. And they will go right through. You put a crop into where they used to move through and it was natural. They just go right through the crop. Like, they're quite happy to graze and feed in those crops. So I think this whole, kind of an interesting nuance, but I'm not sure what to say about the irrigation specifically. Interesting point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we've got quite a few questions left, but only a couple more minutes. So folks, if you want to hop in there and press the up vote button for any ones that you want to make sure we answer. And I'm going to hop down here to Aaron's question. So, oh gosh, we're jumping around here back to time. So would you suspect that deer make up the majority of collisions? Would you suspect that deer make up the majority of collisions due to daily activity periods for deer coinciding with people, i.e. during the daytime? I know you had some interesting results in your camera trapping data about deer and coyote diurnal activity compared to other species in urban environments.
Boy, that's a complex question, Tony. Next. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I mean, I think deer are just so abundant on the landscape. And yes, of course, their peak movement times are dawn and dusk, and that's when they tend to get hit. I'm not sure we're influencing when they're moving, like on the more rural, like on our broader network. I just think there's so many of them, and they're in a lot of locations. And we have, so I think that's why, you see more deer than any other species. I'm not sure I get the part about the coyote and the deer and the urban component with the cameras. I'm not sure I get the question there.
What was that component? Oh, I know you had some interesting results in your camera trapping data about deer and coyote diurnal activity compared to other species in urban environments. So maybe Tyne can just follow up with you on that.
Tyne, I'm just not sure what you're asking me there.
Great. Okay, and I'm just going to do one more here because we do have quite a few, and I know we're not going to make it through. There is a bit of a chain here going, wondering if folks have had any luck receiving wildlife mortality data for specific sections of highway from the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure in recent years. And there's a couple resources that have been shared. But do you have any additional comments on that, Tracy?
Yeah, I think the Alberta Wildlife Watch program, and I know I keep going back to this, but I really haven't seen a better program. It's open source. And so at the end of every year, about 2 months after the end of the year, they release it. So we all have access to it and we can play around with it. It's just such a slick system. BC has a great system too, but it's just not automated the way that Alberta's is. And it would be great to see BC adopt something similar to what Alberta has done. I mean, the code is there, it's been developed, it's been shown to be a successful tool. So hopefully I've experienced that. I mean, they're so good at, I've experienced BC being very good at sharing the data with us, but it's just a more cumbersome process.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up there so we can end at 1 o'clock here. Thank you, Tracy, again so much, and to everyone who tuned in today, and of course to all of our sponsors. I did want to remind folks we still have 3 webinars left in this series. So if you haven't registered for those webinars, you still need to, so you can receive your participant link. So you can head over to CMI's Cred Talks webpage or KCP's winter webinar webpage and make sure you're registered for those. And we will look forward to seeing you next week. For talk number 6, we'll be joined by Rob Ament, who will be giving a presentation titled A Global Overview of Wildlife Crossings, Examples of Maintaining Functional Connectivity Across Roads for a Variety of Species. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody then. Thanks, Haley. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, everybody. I just want to note that there were some really great resources that popped up in the chat at the end there. We'll leave this live for just a minute and then we'll shut it down. Thanks, everyone.